When my grandmother passed away, I inherited her house and a small fortune that I thought came from my grandfather's successful business ventures. But when I started going through the documents in her safe, I found something that would fundamentally destroy my understanding of my family legacy. I found evidence that the wealth I had been handed down, the comfortable life I had lived, was built on valuables stolen from Holocaust survivors. I found proof that my beloved grandparents were complicit in one of history's greatest atrocities, and that realization has haunted me every single day since. I was cleaning out my grandmother's home office when I discovered the documents. There were old photographs, black and white images of beautiful objects, jewelry, paintings, sculptures, religious artifacts. Some were labeled with names and dates. Others had notations I didn't understand at first. Things like Warsaw Estate, Vienna Collection, or Prague Acquisition. I was confused. My grandmother was a Holocaust historian. She had written books about the Holocaust. She had spent her life documenting atrocities. It didn't make sense that these images would be in her personal files. I called my mother and asked her about the documents. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Don't go down that path. Some things are better left alone." Those words should have been my warning. Instead, they made me more determined to understand what I was looking at. I started researching. I cross-referenced the photographs with Holocaust art registries and restitution databases. What I found made me feel physically ill. Many of the objects in those photographs were documented as stolen from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Some of them had been recovered and were now housed in museums. Others remained lost, their histories known only through documentation and photographs like the ones my grandmother had kept. I dug deeper into my family history. My grandparents weren't perpetrators of the Holocaust. They were living in neutral countries during the war. But they were opportunists, they were collectors, and they were people who took advantage of the chaos and desperation of the Holocaust to acquire treasures that would make them wealthy. The documents I found told a story that made my stomach turn. My grandfather had connections to art dealers and collectors who trafficked in looted Holocaust property. He had purchased items, in some cases for pennies on the dollar, from people who were desperate, displaced, and had nothing left. Some of the transactions happened during the war itself. Others happened in the immediate aftermath, when survivors had lost everything and were selling family heirlooms just to survive. I found receipts. I found letters. I found personal journals where my grandmother had documented the provenance of pieces, seemingly aware that they were stolen. And yet she had kept them. She had built her life around them. She had used the wealth from selling them to establish herself as a respected Holocaust historian and philanthropist. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. I sat in that office for hours, surrounded by the evidence of my family's complicity, feeling as if the ground beneath me was crumbling. Everything I thought I knew about who I was, where I came from, was a lie built on the suffering of people who had already endured unimaginable trauma. Before we continue, we would like to thank all of you who support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing our content. The only appreciation we ask of you is that you subscribe, like, and share this video if you are not yet one of our subscribers. Thank you. I called my mother again. This time I didn't ask permission. I told her what I had found and I demanded answers. She came to the house, and when she saw the documents laid out, she broke down. She told me that she had always known, at least in part. She had asked her parents about the origins of their collection when she was a teenager, and they had shut her down immediately. She had chosen not to press further. She had chosen to accept the comfort and security that came from inherited guilt. "I told myself it was history," she said through tears. "I told myself that what happened had already happened, that it couldn't be undone. I told myself that investigating would only hurt people, that it was better to let sleeping dogs lie." "That's not what you taught me," I said, my voice sharp with anger. "You taught me that we have a responsibility to truth. You taught me that silence is complicity. And yet, you've been silent this entire time." She had no response. There was nothing she could say that would undo decades of her own willful ignorance. I contacted a Holocaust restitution organization. I told them my story and turned over all the documents I had found. Within weeks, they had identified multiple items that had been stolen from specific families. Families that had been murdered, displaced, or scattered across the world during the Holocaust. I found survivors, or rather, descendants of survivors. I found people whose grandparents had owned pieces that my grandparents had collected. I found families who had been searching for their stolen heritage for 70 years. When I reached out to them, I couldn't find the words to apologize. How do you apologize for the sins of your family? How do you say, "I'm sorry that my grandparents profited from your family's suffering"? What words are adequate for that kind of transgression? But I tried. And something unexpected happened. Instead of anger and rejection, many of these families responded with cautious hope. Some of them didn't want anything from me. They just wanted acknowledgement. They wanted someone from the family that had stolen from them to finally say the words, "What my family did was wrong." After making contact with these families, I made a decision. I was going to liquidate my inheritance. Every penny that came from objects stolen during the Holocaust, I would return to the survivors and their descendants. I would also work with restitution organizations to track down and return any remaining physical objects that could be recovered. My extended family was furious. My aunts and uncles called me a traitor. They accused me of destroying the family legacy, of disgrace, of throwing away opportunities and security. They said I was being naive and self-righteous. They said I couldn't possibly undo history by giving away money. But I could do something. I could at least try. The process of identifying exactly how much of my inheritance was tainted was complicated. Some came directly from the sale of stolen items. Some came from investments made with proceeds from those sales. Some was simply the accumulated wealth of a life built on that foundation. My lawyer helped me trace what could reasonably be considered restitution money, and I set aside nearly everything I had inherited. Before we continue, we would like to thank all of you who support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing our content. The only appreciation we ask of you is that you subscribe, like, and share this video if you are not yet one of our subscribers. Thank you. I began working with organizations dedicated to recovering Holocaust-looted art and property. Through them, I was able to return several items that had been preserved in my grandmother's collection to families or to museums that had agreed to hold them in trust for the rightful heirs. For families where no direct heirs could be found, I made donations to Holocaust memorials and educational institutions dedicated to teaching the next generation about what happened. I met with Samuel, a Holocaust survivor, whose family had owned a Chagall painting that my grandfather had purchased in 1946. Samuel was 92 years old when we met. He told me that his mother had wept when she had to sell that painting. It was the last piece of her former life. He had spent 70 years wondering what happened to it. When I told him it was in a museum, that it had been preserved, that his family could now know its fate, he cried. He held my hands and said, "You don't have to do this. Your family is not your responsibility." But it was. It is. We inherit not just money and objects from our families, we inherit their history, their choices, their secrets, and sometimes we inherit their sins. I didn't choose what my grandparents did, but I can choose how to respond to it. I can choose accountability over denial. I can choose to make things right even when it costs me everything I thought was mine. This journey has fundamentally changed who I am. I gave up financial security that I thought was guaranteed. I faced rejection from my own family. I confronted the reality that people I loved and respected were complicit in one of humanity's darkest chapters. And I learned that doing the right thing often means losing things you thought were important. But I've also learned something more profound. I've learned that there is a kind of freedom that comes with facing the truth, no matter how painful it is. There is a kind of peace that comes with trying to make restitution, even when you know you can never fully undo the harm. There is a kind of strength that comes from choosing your own values over your family's legacy. I've become an advocate for Holocaust restitution. I use my story to encourage others to examine their own family histories, to ask difficult questions about where wealth came from, to understand that complicity isn't always obvious. I work with organizations dedicated to finding and returning looted property to survivors and their families. I don't know if what I've done is enough. I'll never know if it's enough, but I know that it's something. I know that I've chosen to be different from my grandparents. I know that I've chosen conscience over comfort. Sometimes I think about my grandmother, the woman who spent her life writing about the Holocaust while hoarding the treasures stolen from its victims. I wonder what internal conflict that created for her. I wonder if she ever allowed herself to fully acknowledge what she had done. I wonder if she was living a kind of constant cognitive dissonance, being a voice for the victims while simultaneously profiting from their victimization. I don't judge her anymore. Not because what she did was okay, it wasn't, but because judgment without understanding is just another form of blindness. I've learned that my grandparents were complex people. They were not villains in a simple narrative. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices to ignore the suffering around them and benefit from it. And that perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of all. That atrocity doesn't require evil people. It requires ordinary people who choose not to see. My life is very different now than I thought it would be. I'm not wealthy. I'm not secure in the way I expected to be. But I'm free. I'm free from the weight of inherited guilt. I'm free from the hypocrisy of benefiting from other people's suffering. I'm free to look survivors in the eye and say, I'm trying to make this right. And to anyone watching this who feels complicit in systems of injustice, who feels burdened by family legacy, who wonders if they can make a difference, I want you to know that you can. It starts with seeing the truth. It continues with choosing to act. And sometimes that's enough. Not to undo history, but to change the future. Not to erase guilt, but to transform it into something meaningful. That's what I've learned from my family's dark secret, and that's what I'm trying to do with my life now.